to Free Speech Nation with me, Josh Howie, where it is all go, go, go. It's an extraordinary night of breaking news. Tim Davies, the Director General of the BBC, has announced resignation this evening amid allegations of bias at the corporation. In a statement, Davies says, "There have been some mistakes made, and as a General Director, I have to take ultimate responsibility. The move comes following a torrid week for Britain's national broadcaster after it was accused of airing a doctored clip of a speech by President Trump and failing in its coverage of Gaza and trans issues. Deborah Turness, the broadcaster's CEO of News, has also resigned. In a message posted on social media, Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy said, "I want to thank Tim Davies for his service to public broadcasting over many years. He has led the BBC through a period of significant change and helped the organisation to grip the challenges it has faced in recent years. The BBC is one of our most important national institutions. Every day it tells the story of who we are, the people, places and communities that make up life across the UK. Now, more than ever, the need for trusted news and high-quality programming is essential to our democratic and cultural life and our place in the world. As a government, we will support the board as it manages this transition and ensures that the Charter Review is the catalyst that helps the BBC to adapt to this new era and secures its role at the heart of national life for decades to come." Kemi Badenoch said Tim Davies and Deborah Turness had finally taken responsibility, but that a catalogue of serious failures at the BBC runs far deeper, the Tory leader said in a statement on X. "It's right that Tim Davies and Deborah Turness have finally taken responsibility and resigned from the BBC, but let's be honest, this has been a catalogue of serious failures that runs far deeper. The culture at the BBC has not yet changed. BBC Arabic must be brought under urgent control. The BBC's US and Middle East coverage needs a full overhaul. And on basic matters of biology, the corporation can no longer allow its output to be shaped by a cabal of ideological activists. The new leadership must deliver now genuine reform of the culture of the BBC, top to bottom, because it should not expect the public to keep funding it through a compulsory licence fee unless it can finally demonstrate true impartiality." And in a statement on X, Nigel Farage has said Davies and Turness going must be the start of wholesale change. The government need to appoint somebody with a record of coming in and turning companies and cultures around. Preferably, it would be someone coming in from the private sector who has run a forward-facing business and understands PR. This is the BBC's last chance. If they don't get it right, there will be vast numbers of people refusing to pay the licence fee. So I am now joined by the Shadow Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, Nigel Huddleston. Nigel, welcome to the show. We've just read out Lisa Nandy's statement there. She's right, I think, personally, on what the BBC represents, how it's our great sort of cultural institution. But do you agree with the idea that it's just a couple of problems, that it can be solved?
No, I'm afraid the volume of complaints, the volume of criticisms, the multiple examples of bias make this a much bigger issue than a couple of one-offs. These things did not happen by accident. These were deliberate editorial decisions by journalists and editors to put things out that put words in people's mouths, that misinterpreted comments, or indeed were straightforwardly biased. So there's something systematically wrong here. So I think Tim Davies was right to go because the buck stops at the top.
So it stops at the top, but do you think that it can actually be salvaged?
I do. I mean, to the extent that the BBC is a long-established global institution, something that we used to be all very proud of, because it was based on trust and confidence in its impartial news coverage. The problem is there are too many examples now of that impartiality being sideswiped. And that's against both the Charter, but also the editorial guidelines of the BBC, which is why I say there's something quite cultural and systematic here. People have allowed this to happen, and then reviews have happened and no action has been taken. So serious moves need to be taken here. We want the BBC to thrive. We want the BBC to do very well, but it can only do so based on confidence and trust and impartiality. And I'm afraid that has been lost recently. So there is an opportunity to build it back. But if they don't, then no surprise, licence payers, taxpayers, might move with their feet before there's any government action here. I mean, I think we all know lots of people who are giving up their licence fees already because they don't like the BBC. That needs to stop, but it can only do so with rebuilding that trust and confidence.
Well, you've mentioned trust twice, and I agree that that seems to be the fundamental, most important factor here. Your former leader, Boris Johnson, he said that he would refuse to pay the licence fee. Many other people, as you point out, have already stopped paying the licence fee. What do you think it's going to take to rebuild that trust then? Because the resignation of two senior executives, I think you also correctly identified the problem is a cultural issue. How do you actually get to grips with that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. Just changing the leadership will not solve the problems. It needs to be much deeper. And this is why there are perfectly fair and reasonable accusations of institutional bias here. I genuinely don't believe that some of the people at the BBC know that they are biased in the coverage. That is the definition of institutionalism. They surround themselves with people who think like them, believe the same things. Therefore, having a go at Donald Trump or being very anti-Israel is perfectly fair and reasonable. That is not consistent with impartiality, which is why it really needs to fundamentally change. Now, as I said, the BBC does a lot. It does a lot of good programming. It does a lot more than news and current affairs. But the real problems do seem to be in the news and current affairs coverage. And this is now the examples given in that really long letter to the board the other day. I mean, I read it and I was horrified by it. You know, I'd heard of some of them, but when you read example after example of bias, it really is a horrible situation. The BBC needs to change, and whoever the new DG is, they need to get a grip and get a grip quickly. And we want them to succeed, but at the problem, the BBC is its own worst enemy.
Yeah, I mean, you know, those examples, I read the same thing. But, you know, we've covered those examples on this show and on this channel for the last few years. And, yeah, when you read it like that, and you also, I think, when you read it in a period of near sanity and you read some of the things that happened before, it seems even more insane. But they didn't seem to take notice at the time. Those complaints that went through, they weren't acted upon, they weren't listened to. Surely part of the problem, and I keep on bringing this up, but is that the BBC marks its own homework.
Yes, you're making a really important point there. And these are the things that we're looking at as part of our policy renewal process, because, you know, the BBC, an important institution, public service broadcasting overall, is something that we care about, we care deeply about. But it is based on these principles of fairness and honesty and trust. And if the BBC breaks that, then the whole system, the charter comes into question, the licence fee comes into question. But it is pervasive. This is not a one-off. And I think as well, you know, this is why Tim Davies had to go, because he's recognised that he probably knew about some of these things, was made aware of them, and was unable to change. So whoever comes in now has an awesome responsibility, and I really do mean that. It's not going to be an easy job to really make that change meaningful now, because otherwise that trust will disappear.
I agree with you. You know, there are people who, as the furore is built up over the last week, will say that there's this kind of right-wing conspiracy to bring down the BBC, to destroy the BBC. It seems like you, and as a representative of the Conservative Party, you know, that isn't your intention. I mean, you know, I know this is a ridiculous question almost to, you know, even if it was true, you wouldn't answer. But what do you think about these ideas that, it's, you know, the right wing are out to get the BBC, to destroy the BBC? Because the way that you're speaking about the BBC, I personally agree with, which is that ideally I would like it to be fixed. I would like that trust to be re-established.
Yeah, if the BBC didn't exist, there'd be something missing in the UK's broadcast ecosystem. And of course, you know, with its local radio or Strictly or all sorts of things, there's a lot of things to admire about the BBC. But it's this news and current affairs that keeps being the problem area. We don't want to destroy the BBC. We want the BBC to be the best version of itself. We want it to be that ethical, that trusted source for news and current affairs that it used to be. We don't want to see it destroyed. But given that it is based on licence fee paying money, they've got to listen to the licence fee payers. And they're not all right-wing people, by the way, complaining about the BBC. When you look at that example, you know, the discipline of Martine Croxall for correcting pregnant people to women, that's not a left and right political spectrum thing. I've had constituents who voted Labour and other parties come to me and say that was ridiculous. This is not a right-wing issue. This is an issue about a pervasive culture that transcends left and right. It just isn't common sense. The BBC, I'm afraid, has lost touch with common sense British public. It's not the traditional right-left political spectrum, though believe me, there's plenty of examples of that. But also other things like you don't deliberately and consciously doctor a speech for the former and potential future president of the United States. You know, that goes beyond left-right. That is terrible. The comments being made now by the US and the president of the United States about the BBC are really disheartening. You know, he's saying something about a beloved British institution, but the problem is he's right, because they doctored a speech, irrespective of whether you're on the right or the left. That's not on. If that was Kamala Harris, if that was somebody else, it's just not on. And I say this is the problem here. There's something really quite pervasive. We've got to get back to having a trusted institution with very, very trusted, honest, straightforward news coverage.
Yeah, well, that's it. I guess the framing would be it's about politically left and right, and I totally agree with you. These issues that have been talked about, these that have been exposed, you know, the pregnant women, you know, only women can have babies. That's not a left or right issue, and actually many of the leading proponents of pushing against this gender ideology have been people on the left.
Yeah.
As the Shadow Secretary of State for Culture, that's focused on the culture part of it, you identify that it's a cultural issue. What would you do? If you're in power right now, how do you get to and affect and change the culture within the BBC, change that kind of ideological capture? Is it possible?
I think we need a body, a group, to make sure that the BBC abides by its editorial guidelines and its charter, particularly on impartiality. That probably means an external body assessing. The problem is, as you identified earlier on, there's way too much of marking their own homework at the BBC that goes on. I think as well, in hiring practices, the BBC needs to look very carefully about who it hires, what kind of backgrounds, what kind of beliefs, what kind of political beliefs do they have as well. I've got many friends who work at the BBC or did work at the BBC, and they'll often say they were the only Tory in the room. You know, that's not on. You can't have an environment that's meant to be covering news and current affairs where 80%, 90% of the people believe in one political view on the spectrum or another. So it's really important that they look at ways of changing. But I do think we need to look at the hierarchy of the BBC, the decision-making of the BBC, the way that impartiality is assessed. And that means, you know, looking at the board and looking at the editorial guidelines and then making sure that they rigidly stick to them. And it should not be the BBC marking its own homework.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Shadow Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, Nigel Huddleston. So